Hello, I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and welcome to Surviving Bad, where we explore Iowa stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. Today we're going to talk about the curiously dangerous world of stigma. The addicted are often lost in a world of stigma, an insensitive barrier that can magnify fear and insecurity. It can cut you off from help and ultimately leave you to suffer alone. Our guest, Scott Neufeld from British Columbia Center on Substance Abuse, is researching stigma and has both a well-educated and interesting view of the topic. Scott, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Peter. So my name is Scott. Thanks for the little intro there. I did want to clarify one thing very quickly, which is that it's actually the BC Center on Substance Use. And we might return to that topic around terminology a little bit later. But I'm also a PhD student and a PhD candidate, almost at the end of my degree program here in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University, where I'm studying something called social psychology, actually. And so I sort of come to the world of harm reduction and drug policy through my interest in prejudice and stigma towards folks who use drugs. And just kind of broadly sum up the topic of my research, two things. One is that I'm studying not only what stigma is and how it affects people, but more importantly, how people, and by people I mean governments, health authorities, public health departments, how they are trying to challenge or reduce or stop stigma towards people who use drugs. Another important thing about the project that I'm doing is that it's a community-based research project. So that means that the study, the research questions and the design of the study has all been developed in really close coordination and collaboration with people who have lived and living experience of substance use themselves. So that's folks that I've got to know through various community partnerships that are by now close colleagues and good friends who use drugs themselves. Some of them are in recovery maybe. People who've experienced poverty or homelessness, people who are Indigenous and have experienced racism here in Vancouver, and also people who have all been criminalized for their substance use. So we've been working on this project together and trying to kind of have this view from below, from people who are stigmatized for their substance use, looking at how are other people, at least saying that they're trying to reduce stigma towards the folks that I'm working with.
Now, I've talked with a few people before the show in substance abuse prevention and treatment, and they're all enthralled with this discussion about stigma, and yet, curiously, a clear definition of it is sort of missing. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, so I think questions about what is stigma are actually pretty important, not only because it's unclear to a lot of people, but I think because it matters a lot how we define stigma, what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about stigma. So I'm going to lay out a three-part answer here. And I'll start with a definition that I think I've seen a lot in Iowa. So part of the project that I've been doing has been this sort of extended digital online tour of all of the provinces in Canada and all of the states. As it turns out, as a Canadian, I kind of knew this, but there are a lot of states, and Iowa is one of them. So I have done my sort of online search through Iowa, and what I've been looking for is how have people been trying to challenge or reduce stigma in all of these different places. So one thing that I've noticed is a really common kind of definition that people have of stigma is that it's simply, we say there's a stigma around an issue if we don't generally talk about that issue, if it's too embarrassing or shameful to bring it up. And so in this case, when we say that, there's a stigma around substance use, what that means to people is we don't talk about substance use. We don't acknowledge that it's a part of our family. If somebody dies of an overdose, we might not even mention that in their obituary, for example. We don't acknowledge that it's a part of our communities. So we just keep it secret and silent. And so for many people who have that sort of definition of stigma, what it means to them to be challenging or trying to reduce stigma is just to talk about it, to bring it out into the open, to break the silence on stigma. And I've talked to a couple of folks that are doing really great work around that in Iowa. I think about a guy named Ron, and he's with a group called Crush in Iowa. And that's really kind of the core of the work, is just trying to get people who are in recovery to get out and encourage other people to just start talking about this issue, recognize that it does exist. But the thing with that definition of stigma is it's a little bit limited. That's really not all that stigma is. It's not only that it's, the things that we don't talk about. A little bit more psychological or social psychological definition that I often see on different websites is a little bit more maybe detailed. And in this case, people kind of say stigma, it's sort of a mixture of a whole bunch of bad things that we can do or say to each other as human beings, as members of social groups. So you see these long sentences like stigma is discrimination and prejudice and stereotypes and mistreatment and being mean to people because of some discrediting mark that you have as a part of a group. So so all those things apply to people who use drugs. And that's a pretty good definition. That's probably the most common definition that you'll find, something like that. But to me, it's also missing something, which is a key question, I think, which is where does that stigma come from? And why does it exist? So my definition that I use and how we're approaching this project is a little bit different. And it actually has a bit more to do with history and politics. So in this case, I say stigma is ultimately a kind of strategy that people who have power use to exclude certain groups within society that they don't like, or that are politically inconvenient, or that need to be exploited or disadvantaged for some reason. So there's a lot of historical examples of this. So if we think about the very first drug laws in both Canada and the United States, they're all about opium. And the only people that are smoking opium are people who are coming from China. And in this case, these first drug laws, they're really, being put out there as a way of criminalizing and excluding and stigmatizing people who don't look like the majority, people who are coming from China. And that's sort of an important way that people in power are trying to exclude and demonize that group. So that's sort of my definition of stigma.
I'd like to continue this conversation. We need to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll talk some more about stigma. See you after the break. You don't want to miss this.
While a lot is changing in our world, at Mediacom, our focus remains the same, making sure you have the fastest, most reliable connection possible. During this critical time, we know your needs are changing. You may be working or learning from home, relying on telemedicine, or finding new ways to keep everyone entertained. If you need more speed, call or go online, and Mediacom will double your speed immediately for as low as $10 more a month for 1 year.
There are everyday actions to help prevent the spread of respiratory diseases. Wash your hands. Avoid close contact with people who are sick. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. Stay home when you are sick. Cover your cough or sneeze. Clean and disinfect frequently touched objects with household cleaning spray. For more information, visit cdc.gov/COVID-19. This message brought to you by the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're talking about stigma, a problem that may be the biggest impediment to treating substance use disorder and addiction. Scott, you started talking about the idea of what stigma is, and I get a little confused. Is it a noun? Is it a verb? How does it work? But it seems to me that by its very nature, it challenges people. And that challenge may be met with people not being engaged or choosing not to look at something and not talk about it, minimize it, or it may trigger a response, more compassionate, more positive one. And obviously that we're doing this show because we hope, knowing that stigma is inherently a huge impediment to successful interventions in substance use disorder, that people will look at it differently. Let's say we're looking at the average teen that's now growing up in a world where there's a whole lot of stigma, and not only just substance use disorder, but how much money you have, what clothes you wear, what friends you have. How would you work with them in defining sort of the challenge of stigma in their lives and what they need to address?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. I think what you're hitting on there is there is sort of this double-sided nature of stigma that on the one time we use and benefit from stigma all the time. So we want to stigmatize some things that we think are unhealthy and are harmful. And, that's sort of been a really key tactic, especially around substance use. We can think about, all kinds of prevention campaigns or PSAs that are out there that are really designed to, show you the really difficult and troubling aspects of substance use and dependence that can evolve. And we try and stigmatize those things because we don't want people to get into them. But unfortunately, what that ends up meaning is that people that are into those situations of dependence and substances, they're kind of stuck, and they're stuck with this stigma that we've put onto those things because we want to keep people safe from it. But unfortunately, that stigma ends up becoming this barrier. And so I think what you were hitting on there is that it's got this connection with compassion. When we see or run into situations where clearly someone is, as part of a stigmatized group, how do we respond? And I think, the most common way that we see people responding is with all these mean things that I'd mentioned before, that we maybe distance ourselves, we maybe treat them unfairly, we maybe assume we know things about what someone who uses drugs is going to be like or do, and we may not actually know anything about their lives. So how I would, advise people to, how should we respond if we meet someone from a stigmatized group? My hope is that we can replace ultimately that stigma with compassion. We can try and understand, how is this person, a person like me? How are they a fellow human being? How are they someone who, has a complicated history and life that isn't this one-dimensional stereotype that I think I know everything about because I know this one aspect of your identity? How can I understand you as a real human being and show compassion and love towards you? And I think the same thing applies. You mentioned maybe sort of sometimes that stigma we can internalize it ourselves. We can start to believe, maybe if we're someone who uses drugs, that all those stigmatizing things that we've heard other people say about us are true about ourselves. So sometimes there's this need for self-compassion too, to try and break out of that and realize, actually, I am worth it. I am worth, someone who deserves to be treated well, who deserves to be respected, who has human rights, who has dignity. Those are all things that stigma tries to take away, but we can give that back to ourselves, and we can give that back to our neighbors and community members by changing the way that we think about people.
Now, you look at programs around this hemisphere. What have you seen in terms of programs that are dealing with this issue, and what are some of the sort of the good things you've seen and how you see this going? Yeah,
so there's lots of really cool stuff that's out there, really inspiring, ways that people try and do this, try and reduce stigma towards people who use drugs. And I would say there's lots of good examples. There's some examples of kind of like, don't totally know what you were going for there. But a really common way that people approach this is that they are trying to share stories of how people have been impacted by substance use. They're trying to share that really, complex backstory of what makes this person a human being first, and not only defined by their substance use, either that's current or in the past. So often you'll see, videos that maybe briefly share somebody's story of, how difficult their life has been, maybe that led them to start using substances, or maybe it just shares how horrible it's been, to be someone with a substance use dependence, and how badly they've been treated because of that, and how they didn't deserve to be treated like that, and how that made everything harder for them. Or other examples that you'll often see out there is people that actually try and get real people with lived experience of substance use or addiction into a room with folks and try and just share their story in person and answer questions and dispel those generalizations and assumptions. Those can all be ways of humanizing people who use drugs and helping to reduce that stigma and build that compassion.
That's a great point. When we come back, we'll talk about the relative secrecy of stigma, a shadow that casts judgment not only on the affected, but also the very ones that could be most helpful. You don't want to miss this. We'll see you all after the break.
There are everyday actions to help prevent the spread of respiratory diseases. Wash your hands. Avoid close contact with people who are sick. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. Stay home when you are sick. Cover your cough or sneeze. Clean and disinfect frequently touched objects with household cleaning spray. For more information, visit cdc.gov/COVID-19. This message brought to you by the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
Right now, millions of people and billions of devices are connected to the internet. Homes, businesses, hospitals, schools. The security and reliability of these connections are more important than ever. That's why at Mediacom, we've built a network to protect them. A network that sees threats, fixes problems before they occur, and keeps you going with 99.99% network reliability. While a lot is changing in our world, at Mediacom, our focus remains the same, making sure you have the fastest, most reliable connection possible. During this critical time, we know your needs are changing. You may be working or learning from home, relying on telemedicine, or finding new ways to keep everyone entertained. If you need more speed, call or go online, and Mediacom will double your speed immediately for as low as $10 more a month for 1 year.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. I'm your host, Peter Komendowski. We're talking about stigma with researcher Scott Neufeld. As not a researcher, and you're talking about stigma, it sort of sounds a little bit like bullying to me. I mean, is this a form of abuse that we exercise on people, or is stigma of a little different ilk? I mean, I just feel like, boy, if you stigmatize somebody, you're being really mean to them.
For sure. I mean, and I think that's a pretty common way that people would understand it, for sure. I tend to think about it a little bit differently. I mean, I think when we think about bullying, we think about, an individual person being mean to another individual person because they're a bad person or something like that. And as a more socially minded kind of researcher and thinking more about the wider histories behind the beliefs that we have and the actions that we take towards our fellow human beings, I tend to think that stigma, especially stigma around substance use, is a much more bigger problem than just kind of one-on-one bullying. So I think about, all the ways that we have these messages communicated to us about substance use, about who poses a threat to us, who we need to exclude and be mean to. Those aren't individual decisions that each of us make. We're all very influenced by how those stereotypes and perceptions are communicated to us through media, the way that journalism, for example, tells these really scary stories about substance use, which in most cases are really sort of maybe kind of extreme examples, or sometimes they mix up the effects of certain substances with like some forms of mental health issues around really extreme psychosis, and say, oh, that's what happens if you use this substance. And it's like, well, it's maybe a little bit more complicated than that. So there's lots of ways that, we have this stigma around substance use. People use drugs communicated to us. Politicians is another really common one. Politicians are often very motivated to communicate to potential voters that there are very grave threats out there that they alone know how to protect you from. And a really common way to do that is to say, people who use drugs, they're infesting, they're taking over our neighborhoods, they're going to murder your families, and I am the sole solution to that problem. And that's just another example of how that stigma is really useful, because it scares us. It scares us. We believe it, and then we want to, we believe those things, and when we act them out ourselves. So I think if we take this more compassionate approach and say, well, I need to actually understand who this person is, what their backstory is, why they're doing what they're doing, why they're using substances the way they are. How can I maybe help them? How can I see them as a human being? Helps us cut through a lot of that stigma that we've really been taught.
Have you had in your research interactions with people that have a great deal of experience being part of a stigmatized culture? And what can you tell us about how they feel and how they respond to it? And we've talked about the side that's doing the stigmatizing. What about the stigmatized?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So that was actually the first part of my research. It was a whole bunch of focus groups, interviews in small groups in a community here in Vancouver called the Downtown East Side, which is where a lot of folks who have very low incomes, a lot of folks that are using substances live in this neighborhood. And so I was getting a bunch of these folks together in a room. A lot of them are Indigenous folks that have experienced racism, all of them people that use drugs, opioids specifically. And I was talking about some of their experiences of stigma. And they're horrible. They're just dehumanizing, ways that people just felt completely excluded, degraded. People talk about, also how it's not always just about their substance use. It's also about their race. It's about their class, how they're followed in stores, how they're, kicked out of businesses, how they're, spit at on the street. All these just really, really degrading experiences. And I think there are different experiences of stigma for maybe more middle-class folks who are less connected to the street. Their experience of stigma might just be that, I have this problem with opioid dependence and I don't think I can tell anyone about it. And that's also stigma. That's preventing them from being able to talk about it. But I'd say that's a very different experience of stigma than someone who's, maybe homeless and using drugs as a way to try and cope with their situation, and is also getting, routinely beat up on the street or degraded or called names as people drive by in their car. Those are different experiences, but they're both stigma.
And these are very real. I mean, these are experiences that are documented in the world. I mean, in a lot of aspects, like where I live, we don't get to see a lot of that. There's not a lot of empathy. Now, obviously, in the work I do and the people I get to interact with, I do, but in general, and talking to people in normal walks of life, this is almost an invisible population of people. Is it the fact they're stigmatized that made them invisible?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it depends where you are. And I think that's why it's important to understand stigma in its context. So Iowa is probably a very different context. It's a bit more rural, as I understand, than my experience here in a larger city in Vancouver. And the visibility of people using drugs or people out on the street is a major factor there. So people are using substances all over. If you've got a house and you've got a bit more income, you're probably able to hide that. If you don't, you're not able to. So you're much more of a target of that really blatant dehumanization and stigmatization out on the streets. But if you're kind of hiding in your house, and you're able to keep that more secret, that's very different. That is why stigma can make it seem like those folks are really invisible.
Well, thank you very much. And we're going to take a short break, and I'd like to invite you back to share some comments and good advice. Stay with us. You don't want to miss this. We'll see you after the break.
I don't know how we would have survived without Mediacom. We have 5 kids, my wife and I, and we have Mediacom for all of our internet and all of our cable services. So I'm stuck in my house, but at the same time, I'm connected to people all over the world, and it's been fantastic.
Thanks to Mediacom, I've had reliable internet to continue to work business as usual, so that I can continue to provide for myself and my family.
Right now, we all feel like the world is in a standstill. The internet has played a huge role in allowing us to stay connected to our jobs and the kids schooling online and finding fun and creative ways to stay connected with the ones that we love. We couldn't do it without Mediacom.
There are everyday actions to help prevent the spread of respiratory diseases. Wash your hands. Avoid close contact with people who are sick. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. Stay home when you are sick. Cover your cough or sneeze. Clean and disinfect frequently touched objects with household cleaning spray. For more information, visit cdc.gov/COVID-19. This message brought to you by the National Association of Broadcasters and this station.
Today on Surviving Bad, we're taking a moment to talk about stigma, a powerful and dangerous symptom of a culture often afraid to face its own problems. Let's hear what final words of advice Scott has for us.
All right, so listen, for people who use drugs, stigma is literally life-threatening. It kills people. It prevents them from seeking treatment. It prevents them from seeking help. Ultimately, that's what it's about. For people who don't use drugs, who are worried about the substance use of others, stigma doesn't help you either. It makes it less likely that the people that you care about, that you love, who are using substances, are going to ask for help or receive it. And when they need help, it's going to make it even less likely that the people that you care about are going to survive this overdose crisis that we have. I think some of the advice that I would give for people that are worried about stigma, first of all, just acknowledge that people who use drugs are a part of your community. They're part of your family. They are a part of your neighborhood. They're part of your state. They're human beings. They have rights and they deserve dignity. And I would say question your stigma. Be curious about it. Don't just assume it and digest everything that you've ever heard from a politician or media. Think about who benefits from those nasty beliefs that you have about people that you don't know. Think about the effects of that stigma. Try and replace that stigma with compassion, with non-judgment. And you can do that by getting to know the stories and the backgrounds of people that use drugs. Really great organization right in Iowa that's actually known around Canada and the United States for its work is the Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition. I'd really recommend you check out some of their work. They're doing really great work, just showing love and compassion to people that use drugs. And there's ways that you can maybe get in touch with them, support their work, and learn about those stories. That can be a great way of challenging the stigma that all of us have really digested and believed. It is not doing anybody any favors, other than people who maybe benefit from stigma, which is not most people.
Now, one short question. How have you changed in the process of your research?
That is a really good question. I mean, I grew up in a rural town outside of Vancouver, very much believing that people who use drugs are scary and dangerous. And if I ever got connected with those people, that would be a major failure for me, my family, and my community. I've learned a lot since then. And I would say, especially the biggest thing for me has just been becoming friends with people who regularly use substances, who are in recovery, and to see how badly that stigma that I grew up with has affected them. To see, how cruelly people treat them because of those stereotypes and assumptions that people have. And I think just gaining those friendships, I know that my life has benefited immensely. I feel like I've grown in my ability to be compassionate from people who are different from me. I'm still learning. I still have those pangs of stigma and that just anxiety in some situations that I get into, but I'm learning to overcome it. And I'm learning to see people as people who deserve love, who deserve compassion.
That's a wonderful message, and thank you for sharing it with us today. And thank you all for joining us today. You can go to our website, ahealthyiowa.org, for more information. Keep your eye on Mediacom MC22 for our next episode of Surviving Bad, where we explore Iowa's stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. On Mediacom MC22, your local programming leader.